Donald Trump says he may act against Iran before talks even begin. As protests turn deadly and the internet goes dark for over 84 hours, Iran may be closer to a breaking point than ever before. Over 500 people are dead, thousands arrested, the economy has collapsed, and the world is watching as the 86-year-old supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, faces one of the most serious challenges to his decades-long rule. Is this the end of the Islamic Republic, or the beginning of something far more dangerous? In this video, we're breaking down the Iranian crisis of 2026 using the latest verified reports. We'll look at what triggered this uprising, how the regime is responding, what Trump is planning, and what happens next.
So Iran's in big trouble. It looks to me that the people are taking over certain cities that nobody thought were really possible just a few weeks ago. We're watching the situation very carefully. I've made the statement very strongly that if they start killing people like they have in the past, we will get involved. We'll be hitting them very hard where it hurts. And that doesn't mean boots on the ground, but it means hitting them very, very hard where it hurts. So we don't want that to happen. There have been cases like this where President Obama totally backed down. But this is something pretty incredible that's happening in Iran. It's an amazing thing to watch. They've done a bad job. They've treated their people very badly, and now they're being paid back. So let's see what happens. We're watching it. We're watching it very closely.
Let's dive in. To understand why tens of thousands of Iranians are risking their lives in the streets, you have to look at their wallets. The spark that ignited these protests on December 28th wasn't ideology. It was hunger. The Iranian currency, the rial, had been struggling for years due to U.S. sanctions that cut Iran off from global banking. These aren't new sanctions. They go back to Trump's first term, when he withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed what he called maximum pressure. But in September 2025, something changed that made an already dire situation catastrophic. The UK, France, and Germany triggered what are called snapback sanctions at the United Nations. These are automatic penalties that kicked in because Tehran failed to address Western concerns about its nuclear program. The mechanism was built into the original 2015 nuclear deal as a safeguard. If Iran didn't comply, sanctions would snap back into place automatically. Iran was already under enormous pressure, but this move pushed the economy over the edge. The government, desperate to stabilize its finances, made a decision that would prove disastrous. They ended the subsidized exchange rate for importers. For years, the Iranian government had maintained an artificial exchange rate that kept the price of imported goods relatively stable. When that subsidy disappeared, the real cost of imports hit the market overnight. This sounds technical, but the impact was immediate and devastating. The price of basic groceries, bread, cooking oil, rice, meat, skyrocketed. In some cases, prices doubled or tripled within days. For families already struggling to survive on wages that hadn't kept pace with inflation, this was the final straw. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your salary can now only buy half of what it could the week before. Your rent is the same, your bills are the same, but suddenly, feeding your family has become nearly impossible. This is the reality that millions of Iranians faced in late December. What began as frustration over the rising cost of living quickly transformed into something much bigger, a fierce anti-regime movement that has now spread to almost every province in the country. This isn't about geopolitics for ordinary Iranians. It's about survival. When you can't feed your family, when every trip to the market becomes a nightmare, when you see your children go hungry, anger turns into action, and that's exactly what happened. The protests started in Tehran but spread rapidly to cities like Mashhad, Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz, and dozens of smaller towns across the country. The regime's response has been described by human rights monitors as a mass crackdown. According to the US-based human rights activist news agency, at least 538 people have been killed in the violence. Of those, 490 were protesters. These aren't just numbers on a screen. Each one represents a life, a family, a story cut short. Reports have emerged of demonstrators being killed during the unrest, according to rights groups. The details that have leaked out despite the internet blackout paint a grim picture. In one particularly disturbing piece of verified footage that made it out of the country, dozens of bodies were seen accumulating outside a morgue south of Tehran. The images are blurred for obvious reasons, but the reality they represent is stark and undeniable. Families are searching for missing loved ones. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Morgues are filling up. Mass arrests have become another tool to crush the movement. Over 10,600 people have been detained by authorities so far. Some are activists who've been organizing protests. Some are students who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some are journalists who tried to document what was happening. Some are just ordinary citizens who made the mistake of being seen on the street during a demonstration. Iranian prisons were already overcrowded before this crisis began. Now, with thousands of new detainees, conditions are reportedly dire. Human rights organizations have expressed concern about torture, forced confessions, and summary trials. In past crackdowns, Iran has used mass arrests not just to remove opposition voices from the streets, but to create a climate of fear. The message is clear. If you protest, you could disappear. Despite these brutal tactics, the protests have only grown in momentum. They've spread from Tehran to dozens of cities, from urban centers to rural provinces. What makes this different from past uprisings is the scale and the persistence. People are not backing down. In 2009, the Green Movement erupted after disputed elections, but it was largely middle class and urban. In 2019, protests over fuel prices were more working class, but lasted only a few days before being crushed. This time, the protests cut across class lines. You have university students alongside factory workers. You have women removing their headscarves in defiance of hijab laws, standing next to elderly shopkeepers who've lost their life savings to currency devaluation. This broad coalition makes the movement harder to dismiss as the work of a small, foreign-backed minority. One of the regime's most powerful weapons in this crisis isn't bullets or batons, it's silence. For more than 84 hours, Iran has been under a near-total internet blackout. The monitoring group NetBlocks, which tracks internet connectivity worldwide, confirmed that the shutdown is deliberate and comprehensive. It's designed to achieve two goals. First, to limit the flow of information out of Iran so the world can't see what's happening. And second, to prevent activists from coordinating or organizing protests. In the digital age, cutting off the internet is like pulling a curtain over an entire nation. The world can't see what's happening inside, and people inside can't organize, can't call for help, can't share videos that might galvanize international support. This isn't the first time Iran has used an internet blackout. In November 2019, during protests over fuel prices, the government shut down the internet for nearly a week. During that blackout, security forces killed over 2,500 people, according to estimates from human rights groups. The blackout gave them cover to act with impunity. This time, the blackout has lasted even longer, and the death toll is already over 500. The longer the internet stays down, the more concerned observers become about what's happening in the dark. But the blackout isn't foolproof. Activists have found ways to circumvent the shutdown, and their ingenuity is remarkable. Reports indicate they're using shortwave radio to communicate, a technology that seems ancient but is nearly impossible to jam completely. Some have gained access to Starlink satellite internet terminals, which connect directly to satellites and bypass ground-based infrastructure. Others are using satellite phones, which are expensive and rare but effective. Some activists are literally traveling to Iran's borders with countries like Turkey, Iraq, or Azerbaijan to connect to cell towers on the other side and send out information. These workarounds are risky and limited, but they've allowed some information to leak out. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has claimed the internet will be restored soon, but he's offered no specific timeline. Every day that passes without restoration suggests the regime is afraid of what the world might see if the lights come back on. Now let's talk about the international dimension, and specifically Donald Trump. The U.S. president has made Iran a central focus of his rhetoric since returning to office just weeks ago. His stance is a complex mix of military threats and claims of diplomatic breakthroughs, and it's keeping everyone guessing. All of this is happening as Trump weighs his next move. Trump has stated publicly that he is considering very strong military action against the ruling regime. The phrase "very strong" is deliberately vague. Does it mean airstrikes? Does it mean targeting specific facilities? Does it mean regime change? Trump hasn't clarified, and that ambiguity is probably intentional. On his Truth Social platform, he posted that the USA stands ready to help Iranian protesters and even suggested he would rescue them if the violence continued. These are bold claims, and they've raised questions about what exactly he means by rescue. Is he talking about military intervention, covert support for opposition groups, cyber attacks on regime infrastructure, humanitarian corridors? Nobody knows for sure, and that uncertainty is part of Trump's strategy. To understand Trump's current position, you have to look at the history. Trump's first term was marked by his decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, in May 2018. He then imposed what he called maximum pressure sanctions, which crippled Iran's economy by targeting its oil exports, banking sector, and access to international markets. The goal was to force Iran back to the negotiating table for what Trump called a better deal. In January 2020, Trump authorized the drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, the powerful commander of Iran's Quds Force. That move brought the U.S. and Iran to the brink of war. Iran responded with missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq, injuring over 100 American service members. Both sides ultimately stepped back from full-scale conflict, but the tension never really went away. During the Biden administration, there were attempts to revive the nuclear deal, but they ultimately failed. Now, 5 years after Soleimani's death, Trump is back in the White House, and Iran is in crisis. The question is whether Trump sees this as an opportunity to finally bring Iran to its knees, or whether he's genuinely interested in a deal that could reshape Middle East dynamics. To regain control and rally support, the government has taken several calculated steps. They've declared 3 days of national mourning for what they call martyrs, including security forces and Basij militiamen killed in the unrest. The Basij is a volunteer paramilitary force loyal to the supreme leader, and they've been on the front lines of the crackdown. By honoring them as martyrs, the regime is trying to frame the conflict as a defense of the revolution rather than an attack on the people. They've organized what they're calling a national resistance march to denounce the violence and bring out supporters to counter the protests. These government-organized demonstrations are designed to show that the regime still has popular support, though it's hard to gauge how many people are participating willingly versus under pressure from employers, universities, or government agencies. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has publicly claimed that the protests are now under total control. But if the situation is truly under control, why is the internet still down? Why are thousands still being arrested every day? Why are there reports of continued clashes in multiple cities? The regime's claims of control ring hollow when compared to the reality on the ground. In authoritarian systems, officials often declare victory prematurely to project strength and discourage further resistance. The truth is probably somewhere in between total chaos and total control. The regime has significant coercive power through the IRGC, the Basiji, and the regular police, but that power is being tested in ways it hasn't been tested before. There's also the question of the regime's internal cohesion. Ayatollah Khamenei is 86 years old. He's been supreme leader since 1989, longer than many Iranians have been alive. Succession is a looming issue, and there are divisions within Iran's political elite between hardliners who want to maintain the revolutionary ideology at all costs, and those who favor some degree of reform and engagement with the West. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is the regime's main enforcer with its own military, intelligence service, and vast economic empire. But even within the IRGC, there are competing factions and interests. If the economic crisis deepens and the protests continue, these internal divisions could become more pronounced. History shows that authoritarian regimes are most vulnerable when their security forces start to fracture, when soldiers and police begin to question whether they're willing to keep shooting their own people, when the cost of maintaining the regime becomes higher than the cost of letting it fall. So what happens next? There are essentially three possible scenarios, though reality might be some messy combination of all three. The first is that the regime survives, just as it has survived every previous challenge over the past 46 years. They continue the crackdown until the protests are crushed. They restore internet access once they feel confident the opposition is sufficiently decimated. They use a combination of repression, propaganda, and limited economic concessions to maintain control. In this scenario, Iran becomes even more isolated, even more authoritarian, and even more dependent on allies like Russia and China. Think of it as the North Korea model: survival through total control and international isolation. The cost would be enormous in terms of human suffering, economic stagnation, and moral legitimacy. But from the regime's perspective, survival is the only goal that matters. The second scenario is reform from within. In this version, the economic crisis and international pressure, combined with the scale of the protests, force the regime to make concessions. Maybe they ease some social restrictions like mandatory hijab enforcement. Maybe they allow limited political reforms, permitting more independent candidates in elections or giving parliament more power. Maybe they enter into serious negotiations with the West over sanctions and the nuclear program, trading nuclear concessions for economic relief. This would be similar to what happened in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, an attempt to reform the system from the inside to save it. The risk, of course, is that reforms can spiral out of control. Once you open the door to change, it's hard to control how far people will push. Gorbachev's reforms ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Iranian hardliners are acutely aware of this history, which is why they resist any concessions. The third scenario is that the revolution succeeds. The protests reach a tipping point where the security forces can no longer contain them, or where significant parts of the military defect to the opposition. The Islamic Republic collapses, and Iran enters a chaotic transition period. This is what happened in several Arab Spring countries, most notably Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. The problem is that revolutions are unpredictable and often lead to outcomes nobody intended. They can lead to democracy, as arguably happened in Tunisia. They can lead to military rule, as happened in Egypt. They can lead to civil war and state collapse, as happened in Libya and Syria. Iran is a large, diverse country with ethnic divisions between Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, and Baloch. It has religious divisions between Shia and Sunni, and between religious and secular populations. It has class divisions between urban and rural, rich and poor. A collapse of the central government could unleash centrifugal forces that are very difficult to control. There's also the risk of external intervention, with regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel all having interests in shaping whatever comes next. Trump's role in all of this is critical but uncertain, and that uncertainty itself is a factor in how events unfold. If he orders military strikes, what would that look like? The options range widely. Targeted strikes on nuclear facilities like Natanz and Fordo, attacks on IRGC bases and command centers, strikes on oil infrastructure to cripple the regime's revenue, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, covert support for opposition groups inside Iran, providing weapons, intelligence, or training. Each option carries enormous risks. Military action could rally Iranians around the regime even if they hate it, turning a domestic crisis into a nationalist cause to resist foreign aggression. It could trigger Iranian retaliation against U.S. forces in the region, against Israel, or against Gulf Arab states. It could spike oil prices and destabilize the global economy. It could draw in other powers like Russia or China who have their own interests in Iran. It could lead to a wider regional war involving Israel striking Hezbollah in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia getting pulled in, Iraq becoming a battlefield, and the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil passes, becoming a war zone. On the other hand, if Trump is serious about negotiating, what would a deal look like? Would Iran agree to dismantle its nuclear program entirely in exchange for complete sanctions relief? Would they agree to stop supporting proxy groups in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen? Would they agree to ballistic missile restrictions? And would hardliners in Tehran even accept such a deal, or would they see it as capitulation and a betrayal of the revolution's principles? There's also the question of whether Trump could deliver on any promises he makes. The U.S. Congress would have to lift sanctions, and there's bipartisan skepticism about Iran. European and UN sanctions would have to be lifted as well. Previous nuclear deals have shown how difficult it is to get all parties to agree and then implement complex arrangements. For the Iranian people in the streets right now, these geopolitical calculations probably feel very distant from their immediate reality. They're focused on survival, on not getting shot, on finding food for their families, on searching for arrested loved ones, on trying to connect with the outside world through whatever means they can find. But their fate is inevitably tied to these larger forces. If Trump intervenes militarily, they could find themselves caught in a war zone where bombs don't distinguish between regime targets and civilian neighborhoods. If he negotiates a deal that strengthens the regime by providing sanctions relief without demanding political reforms, they could face an even harsher crackdown as a newly emboldened government moves to eliminate all opposition. If the international community does nothing substantial beyond issuing statements, they're left to face the regime's security apparatus alone, outgunned and outnumbered. To understand the current state of Iran, think of the country like a pressure cooker with a broken valve. The economic sanctions and currency collapse have built up an intense, invisible pressure inside the pot. The heat keeps rising as more sanctions are added, as corruption continues, as the regime spends money on foreign adventures instead of domestic needs. By shutting down the internet and using force against protesters, the government is trying to weld the lid shut, to contain the pressure through sheer force of repression. But the steam, the collective anger and desperation of millions of people, is already beginning to tear the metal apart. The longer the pressure builds without any release valve, without economic relief or political reform, the more violent the eventual explosion will be. And when a pressure cooker finally fails, the destruction is sudden, total, and affects everything nearby. Iran stands at a historic crossroads. With over 500 people dead, thousands arrested, tens of thousands more in the streets, and an economy in freefall, the situation is as serious as it has ever been under the Islamic Republic. Whether the regime can successfully suppress this uprising through continued repression, whether Trump will follow through on his threats of military action or his hints of negotiation, whether the opposition can sustain its momentum in the face of brutal crackdowns, and whether it can unite around a coherent vision for Iran's future, these are the questions that will define not just Iran's trajectory, but the future of the entire Middle East for decades to come. The Iranian people are facing a moment of extreme danger where the cost of resistance is measured in lives, but also a moment of possibility where the future of their country hangs in the balance. What happens in the next days and weeks could reshape the region for a generation and send shockwaves through the global order. We'll be watching this situation closely and bringing you updates as this crisis unfolds. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth coverage, and let us know in the comments. Do you think Trump will actually intervene militarily, or is this all part of a high-stakes negotiation tactic? What do you think Iran will look like a year from now? Until next time.